Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's OpenFOAM and Combustion Simulation webinar. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Andre Weiner. Dr. Weiner is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Fluid Mechanics at the Technical University of Braunschweig, Germany. He obtained his PhD from the Technical University of Darmstadt, where he worked on data-driven boundary layer models for reactive mass transfer processes and multi-phase flows. His current research focuses on computational methods for dimensionality reduction, enhancing fluid dynamic simulations with machine learning, and the management and reproducibility of scientific data. And the title of Dr. Weiner's talk is Active Flow Control via Deep Reinforcement Learning Implemented in OpenFOAM. And if you have any questions during this talk, please submit them through the chat function provided by Zoom. I will ask Dr. Weiner at the end of the presentation on your behalf. Thank you. And the time is yours, Dr. Weiner.
Thanks a lot for the kind introduction, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak in your seminar. So today I will talk a little bit about machine learning in general and what it can do for you as a researcher in fluid dynamics. And then I will focus a little bit more on a topic that is called reinforcement learning and how we can use reinforcement learning to solve control problems. Of course, everything that I'm going to show you today is not just my own work, but it's a collaborative effort of also some students and my supervisor, Richard, at the Institute of Fluid Mechanics. All right, so I would like to start with a little introduction to machine learning and show you like two examples of other fields that I'm not going to introduce so much in detail. And then I would like to talk a little bit more about deep reinforcement learning. And in that section, because I think that most likely most of the listeners are not so familiar with the concepts of reinforcement learning, I would also, spend some time talking on the theory behind deep reinforcement learning, because I don't just want to show you colorful pictures and tell you everything is amazing, right? But I want to also show you a little bit like how it works in the background. And then I will show you how you can implement such reinforcement learning in OpenFOAM, so using OpenFOAM to perform CFD simulations, and using a framework called PyTorch to implement basically the deep learning part of the deep reinforcement learning. And at the very end, I will provide you with some resources that you can use if you get interested in the field and if you want to learn more also about the topics that I'm only going to talk about briefly. All right, so let's get started with an important question. So why should you consider combining machine learning with your current CFD simulations? So there are basically two very important points from my point of view. And the first one, if you have been following the seminar series, you have seen DNS simulations, LES simulations of combustion processes, and these simulations get bigger and bigger, and they produce larger and larger amounts of data. And after having like an amazing visualization of all the small vortices, the big question is, how can I actually generate some knowledge and something useful from these huge amounts of data? How can I actually maybe extract some patterns from that data? And the second point is that our CFD simulations, even though you are not maybe actively using machine learning, they rely on data. If you use a closure model in your LES simulations or closure in your runs simulations, or like tabulated chemistry, for example, in combustion. All those simulations, they, in some sense, they rely on data because they include many, empirical coefficients that have been previously fitted based on some experimental data, most likely. And then on the other hand side, what machine learning mainly does is, first of all, to find patterns in data. So you have algorithms to automatically extract those patterns. And the second important point is that it creates useful representations of data. And I hope that I can show you in a bit like what this means in a bit more detail. So you see these two like areas are very much like complementary. So that's why it's a good idea to learn about machine learning when you do CFD simulations. So I've already talked about data, but I want to give you like a little bit more of an idea what data means, at least to me. So first of all, you have like the obvious kind of data, right? So your flow fields, your velocity vector, your pressure field, and maybe from these quantities you derive some integral quantities like the lift and drag forces, your mass transfer coefficient, your heat transfer coefficient, and so on. And this is, of course, data we are going to work with and we want to work with. But there's other data. So for example, your OpenFOAM solvers, they are going to produce a lot of output in log files, where you find, for example, like min and max values, or for your linear solvers, like what the residuals are and how many iterations were needed to solve the linear system of equations, right? But also, for example, we have maybe output of like here what you see is check mesh, right? We have maybe output like in some sense quality metrics. And maybe you want to find out if there's a connection between the skewness and non-orthogonality of your mesh and how much iterations a certain solver, linear solver, takes in order to find out in a situation which solver might be the best one, depending on the mesh that you are given, right? All right, so there's a huge variety of data that you could potentially work with to improve your CFD simulations. But like, how exactly is it combined? I like to talk about the combination of machine learning and simulations with these kinds of flowcharts, like how the data flows between simulation and machine learning modeling. And the first one, I guess, the most intuitive one is that you have a CFD simulation, a setup, and then you maybe run a bunch of different parameters. You vary the Reynolds number and so on. And these simulations produce some data, and you then use that data to create a machine learning model to have a nicer representation of your data, right? So let's say you have measured the drag coefficient for a bunch of different Reynolds numbers, and then you want to create a model that predicts also for unseen Reynolds numbers the drag coefficient. But in principle, it could be also the other way around, that you are given some data. For example, you have some experimental data, and then you would want to use that data in your simulation. For example, if you want to, let's say you have a wind tunnel experiment, and you want to create a more realistic inlet boundary condition for your, based on your experimental data, you might use a machine learning model in the middle to create a more useful representation of your experimental data, which you can then conveniently use in your simulation to create more realistic simulations. And of course, you can take both of these approaches and you can stack them on top of one another. So you could run a simulation that produces some data, and then you take that simulation, that data, produce a model, which you then use in another simulation, right? And the typical scenario for this kind of workflow would be, for example, multi-scale modeling. So let's say you have one approach where you that operates on a very small scale. Let's say you have like a single isolated rising bubble, and you create data for how this bubble behaves in terms of drag and lift forces for a given Reynolds number, right? And then you create a machine learning model that predicts these drag and lift forces, which you can then use, for example, in a approach that operates on a larger scale. For example, Euler-Lagrange simulations, where you have like particles that are representing your bubbles or particles. And then you can go to, for example, Euler approaches, where you need even more closure modeling. And using machine learning, you can basically transfer the knowledge from one level to the next level. And then there's also a workflow that is a little bit different from the ones that I've shown you before, because it's more interactive. So let's say you have a simulation. That simulation requires a machine learning model, and it also produces some data, and that data will be used to update the machine learning model. And then you run a new simulation with a new model and you generate new data, right? So it's a little bit more interactive. And one example where this is used is, for example, reinforcement learning, what I'm going to talk about more in a bit. Or in general, if you want to solve optimization problems with machine learning. All right, now I've given you like a bird's eye perspective, but you might be still wondering, like, how exactly does this work? Like, how do I implement it? And one misconception that I frequently encounter is that, the idea that machine learning is some kind of generic problem solver. So you're saying, okay, my simulation doesn't perform really well because X, Y, Z. And then, you just want to use machine learning to make it go away. That's unfortunately not how it works. It's not that easy, because machine learning solves only a very specific kind of tasks. And I'm going to show you like a very simple kind of map, which you can use to remind yourself, in case you're not familiar so much with machine learning, what these tasks are that are solved by machine learning. All right, so the first big class of machine learning is called supervised learning. And the types of problem that you solve in supervised learning are regression and classification. So in general, in supervised learning, what you do is you map basically what you have to what you want. So you already know pretty well what you want. So for example, let's say I have for a bunch of different Reynolds numbers, I have recorded, I've measured the drag coefficient, right? And now I want a model that represents something like the red line here, the red dashed line. So this is the type of problem that machine learning solves for you. So you have a model that makes based on an input, makes a continuous prediction. On the other hand side, you might be also interested, if you have a setup, for example, of a flame, let's say, and you want to know if I vary certain parameters, like the mass flux or so, at which point does the flame become unstable? So you perform a bunch of simulations, and then you record basically, okay, my flame was stable or my flame was unstable maybe. And then you want to create like a model to make this data more useful, right? Because you could potentially use that model to switch in a later step between models that are more suitable for the stable state and other models that are more suitable for the unstable state, right? So models that make such a like a discrete prediction, a class prediction, are classification models. And I would just like to show you one example where I used machine learning to solve a regression problem. And what this regression problem entails is that I have one high fidelity simulation of a two-phase flow, and I want to basically transfer some information from this high fidelity simulation to another more simplified simulation to make it more realistic. And in particular, what I want to look at is basically a rising bubble, and you have this bubble is dissolving. So there's mass transferred from the bubble to the surrounding liquid. And so basically first, a two-phase flow solver was used to solve the two-phase flow problem. And then a machine learning model is trained to transfer the data to a simpler approach. And then only the mass transfer is simulated in isolation. That's in a nutshell how it works. I will show you in a bit more detail how. And you can find all the code and write up of how it works if you follow the link that is here at the bottom of the picture of the slide. All right, so how is machine learning used to do the mapping? So first, we have like a specialized two-phase flow solution from tracking code that basically gives us discrete information about the gas-liquid interface. And it also tells us, how the interface is moving and how the bubble, the particle as a whole is moving. So it tells us about the center of mass velocity. And now I want to use this in a very, very simple, simplified simulation, a single-phase simulation, because these two-phase simulations, they are hard to run, and the mass transfer happens on a much smaller scale than the two-phase flow dynamics, right? And now the question is, if I cut away basically the actual bubble, like how do I make the single-phase simulation still realistic, right? And the way how we did it is basically to take this information from the two-phase flow simulation to train 3 different models. One that tells you about the rise velocity of the bubble, which is then used as the inlet velocity in the one single-phase simulation. So we are using it basically to change the reference frame. The second one tells you how the bubble is deforming. So this is going to tell us at runtime, like how we should move this boundary. And the third one is basically telling us if we move this boundary and the inlet velocity changes, how should the velocity on this newly introduced boundary change? Okay. Now I just want to show you like a picture of actually how it works. You see here on the left, this single-phase simulation is changing the mesh is moving, and you get like a physical shape of a bubble with a very physical velocity field. Even so, you have like ignored like the actual two-phase interaction. And on the right side here, you see basically like zoomed in very much around the equator zone, about like a factor of 80. And you see how this species boundary layer is still nicely resolved, which is one advantage that we have in this single phase approach. We can, create very nicely aligned, surface aligned meshes where we can introduce a very large mesh resolution to actually resolve these boundary layers. All right, so up to the second big part of machine learning, which is called unsupervised learning. So this one is a little bit non-intuitive, but it's nonetheless extremely helpful for people working on fluid dynamics. So what it essentially does is you give it some data, and then there's different techniques to extract like patterns from those data. And also here we have basically 2 different subcategories. The first one is called dimensionality reduction. So let's say you have basically 2 variables, x1 and x2. And what dimensionality reduction does is basically to find a more suitable representation for your data. So let's say, if we have some idea of how this variable y1 looks like, we could essentially express our data using just a single coordinate, while losing maybe a little bit of information. And I will show you in a second how this is useful for extracting patterns in fluid flows. And the second one is basically clustering, where you try to take your data points and you try to, put them into groups that are in some sense similar. And very often you will also use a combination of these two. And for example, to create something called reduced order models. And here's an example. We are going to use a technique that is called dynamic mode decomposition, which belongs to the first group, so the dimensionality reduction techniques, plus some additional mass that is happening after the dimensionality reduction. And what it essentially does is it takes like a transient snapshots of a transient flow, and then it decomposes your transient flow into spatial modes that are constant in time, plus some information about how these modes change over time. So what the dynamic behavior of those modes is. And by superimposing the different modes, the different spatial modes, together with their temporal behavior, you can basically reconstruct the original flow. And on top of that, by looking at isolated modes and their dynamics, you can also, figure out what they basically mean dynamically. And one particular nice feature of dynamic mode decomposition is that you get basically a frequency for each spatial mode. So it's very much like, you take a probe of maybe pressure or so from your simulation, and then you do an FFT, and then you get an idea about how the signal in this point is changing in terms of frequency and amplitudes. And the DMD is very much like that, but using the entire flow field basically. Since I think OpenFOAM 2006, you already have a version of dynamic mode decomposition called like a streaming version, implemented as a function object. And but what I'm going to use here after is a library that I've written myself that actually loads the OpenFOAM data and then does the dynamic mode decomposition in Python. And again, you can find like all the details, like how it is implemented, the simulation setup, and the actual implementation of dynamic mode decomposition if you follow the link at the bottom of this slide here. All right, so here is one example. We have a compressible flow past an airfoil. And what you see here is that on top of the airfoil, a shock region forms, like a shock forms, and the region where the flow is supersonic. And then you see that here in the rear part of the airfoil, the boundary layer starts to separate. And you can also see that basically because of the separation, the interaction between separation and the shock here, the shock is kind of moving back and forth. And this phenomenon is called a transonic buffet. One also interesting feature is that you can see here in the shear layer, if we wait for a second, you see in the shear layer here, we have some waves that are basically propagating upstream, and you might be interested in investigating those waves. All right, and just to show you like one thing that we can extract, for example, we can use dynamic mode decomposition to figure out like the basic underlying motion of the buffet, so of the interaction between the shock and the boundary layer. And we can also, determine a characteristic frequency of this isolated mode, or basically we know it, right? And here you see something that looks very much like a RAN simulation, a URAN simulation. So everything smoothed out. This is like the main, the main motion in the flow. This is the main motion of the buffet. You see how basically the shock interacts with here the boundary layer region above the airfoil. All right. So, well, now you might be thinking, okay, I have a problem, but my problem doesn't really fit into any one of those bins, right? And then what you most likely are missing is not really like a machine learning model, but it's more a mathematical or physical or numerical modeling. And what is also important is to know that, you know, typically, if you want to create a real application, it is not just like a single machine learning model or a single technique that you will employ to solve your problem, but it's rather a combination. So, for example, one very interesting topic currently is reduced order modeling of time-dependent fluid flows, right? And what you will very often find are the most popular models, they will employ some sort of dimensionality reduction together with regression. So, for example, you could take, you know, a bunch of different simulations where some parameter was varied, and then you perform a proper orthogonal decomposition of your flow data, and then you will solve, which again like decomposes your data into like spatially constant fields plus temporal coefficients that tell you how the fields are superimposed over time. And then you will create a regression model for only for the temporal coefficients, which live in a like much in a low dimensional space. And then you can basically use those interpolated coefficients to reconstruct the real flow. All right, so there's one big topic of machine learning missing, and this is reinforcement learning. And it will be also the topic of the remainder of my talk. All right. So the essential players in reinforcement learning you find on this slide. So essentially you have an agent that is interacting with an environment, and by means of interaction, learning how to manipulate the environment, which in general like fits the idea of solving control problems. So if you think a little bit more about how we would deploy it in simulations, then your environment might be given by a certain simulation setup. And your simulation is defined by a state, which might be, you know, the flow field or the pressure field, or it might be, you know, just the pressure in certain sensor locations. So in general, in the flow control sense, the state is basically what your sensors give you. And on the other hand side, you have an agent, which is basically some program, which is your, you could say, your control law, that is manipulating the environment in some sense. So it could be, if your environment is a CFD simulation, it could be manipulating a boundary condition of your simulation, right? And after being manipulated, the environment provides a reward, and the reward tells the agent if you know, the manipulation was good towards reaching a global goal, or if it was rather, you know, not really helpful. And the agent uses this feedback from the environment to determine basically which actions are good actions. So which actuations are good actuations to solve your control problem. And of course, everything is time dependent. So what the agent tries to maximize in the end is not just, you know, like a single reward, but it tries to maximize the reward over time, the cumulative reward. Now here's a little bit more of like vocabulary and a little bit of notation that makes it hopefully easier to follow along and also to read like reinforcement learning literature. So first of all, like what I've already mentioned, you have a state, you have an action at time t, and then basically the environment will provide you with some sort of reward. And it will, of course, based on your actuation, it will transition into the next state. So the pressure, maybe the pressure in your probes is going to change to the next time step. And this set of state, action, reward, and next state, this is in general called an experience tuple. And you know, during the run of the simulation, you will basically accumulate a bunch of those experience tuples. And this aggregation of experience tuples is called a trajectory. So what simulations produce for the reinforcement learning to work are trajectories, which is a little bit misleading, you know, in the general physical sense, if you think about trajectories. And there's one more concept that is really important. So I've already mentioned you don't want to like just optimize single rewards, but you want that in the long term, your rewards in the cumulative rewards go up. And the way how this is modeled in reinforcement learning is by means of the so-called return. So the return is basically the sum over all rewards in a trajectory. But you don't simply sum them up, but what you actually do is you weight them using some discount factor. And the discount factor is typically a value slightly lower than 1.0, for example, 0.99. And you take the discount factor to the power of the current time step. And what this does is it gives the optimization problem some sense of urgency. So let's say if you receive a reward of 5, then it will be much more valuable if you receive this reward very early on in the simulation rather than somewhere later. So for example, if your task is to reduce the drag forces, right, then it's better to bring down the drag very quickly than to, you know, wait for a long time before finally the drag goes down. All right, this was reinforcement learning in general, and now I'm going to introduce you to one particular algorithm from deep reinforcement learning. So deep reinforcement learning is basically classical reinforcement learning plus function approximation. And in particular for deep reinforcement learning, these function approximations are going to be deep neural networks. Okay. So if you go a little bit through the literature related to fluid dynamics and reinforcement learning, you will find that PPO is basically the most frequently used algorithm. And there are a couple of reasons for that, which I have like summarized here on this slide. So first of all, what is really helpful is that it supports continuous and discrete action spaces. So basically using the PPO algorithm, you can solve control problems in the sense that you want to predict something continuous. So for example, you want to say, okay, mass inflow is 5.6 cube meters per second, right? Or you could also say valve 1 must be closed and valve 2 must be open, for example. And of course, you can also do like a combination of those actuations. And a second very important point is that it's relatively easy to implement. So the implementation that the results I'm going to show you later on to produce, so the implementation to produce the results I'm going to show you later on entails about maybe 200 lines of Python code and an OpenFOAM boundary condition, essentially. And of these 200 lines of Python code, only like half of it is maybe related to the actual reinforcement learning. And what is important, because our, evaluating the environment, evaluating a simulation might be extremely expensive because you have to run like a time-dependent simulation for, a bit of physical time. So it's important that we can make effective use of the data that we collect. And PPO is maybe not the best suited algorithm for CFD, but it's the best algorithm, let's say, that is currently available in terms of efficiency and robustness. So here is how it is implemented from a bird's eye perspective in the context of fluid dynamic simulations. So essentially down here, you have an agent. And the heart of the agent is basically the policy network. The policy network is like your control law. This is what's basically mapping your sensor input to some actuation. So the actuation might be if you have like a simulation of a cylinder that you rotate the cylinder with a certain speed. And the second component of the agent is a value network. And the value network's only purpose is essentially to stabilize the training of the policy network. And it stabilizes the training by computing something called the generalized advantage estimate. I show you in a bit like how it is exactly defined. Then one very essential point of proximal policy optimization is that it can learn from many trajectories in parallel. So what this allows us to do is, not just to run one simulation, to evaluate the simulation and learn from it, and then to run another simulation, wait until it's done, and then learn again from it, is basically that we can run, for example, 10 simulations in parallel. We learn from all those 10 simulations, and then we run another batch of 10 simulations. And so this accumulation of all the trajectories within one optimization iteration is called a replay buffer. Again, some reinforcement learning jargon, but it's just like the batch of simulations, the outcome of the batch of simulations that you have performed. And very important, PPO is able to work with those batches. Not all deep reinforcement learning algorithms are able to work with those batches. And of course, if you can run like 10 simulations in parallel, the entire training process becomes faster. It's not like that instead of running 10 simulations sequentially, you can just run 10 simulations in parallel, unfortunately. But for example, instead of waiting for 10 simulations to 10 sequential simulations to finish, you only have to wait maybe for 4 or 5 by employing more computational resources. All right, so you might be wondering, like, how does the agent actually explore which actuations are good and which ones are bad? Or how does it decide to take a certain action or perform a certain actuation? And this is also basically, by the way, how the different simulations in your trajectory buffer are going to be different, because there's some random sampling involved. So the agent does actually, or the policy network more precisely, does not directly predict your actuation or your action, but it rather predicts a probability distribution or the parameters of a probability distribution for a certain actuation. So for example, if I want to rotate one part, right, instead of directly outputting the angular velocity of the rotation, I rather output the, for example, mean and standard deviation of my rotation. And then during the exploration phase, the training phase, I will sample from this distribution. All right. So in practice, what we have learned is that instead of using a Gaussian distribution, so the distribution parameterized by mean and standard deviation, it's much better to actually use a beta distribution. And you see these both of these distributions depicted here. Blue is the Gaussian and orange is the beta distribution. And you will immediately see why the beta distribution is more favorable. And that is, it has a compact support. So basically, if you sample from a Gaussian, you can get like arbitrarily small or large values. In practice, that's like really unlikely, but nonetheless, it can happen. And imagine that you sample your angular velocity to rotate your cylinder, and then that velocity is really large. and your CFD simulation is basically going to explode because of the current number limit, for example. Now, instead, with the beta distribution, which has a value range between 0 and 1, we can precisely prescribe the bounds of our control. So we can, for example, take this output between 0 and 1, and if the actual output that we want is maybe between minus 10 and 10, we can just scale the value range to the value range that we actually want in our application. So we have a precise control about how large or small our actions can be. Now, imagine you have run a bunch of simulations. You have produced these trajectories full of, the experience tuples, current state, current action, next state, and reward. And now the first piece, the first training in the PPO is the training of the value network. And the value network is trained by gradient descent based on the value loss. So the essential piece here is the loss function for the value network, which is simply like the mean squared error between the value output, the output of the value network for a given state, and the actual return, which we compute directly from the trajectory. So from all the simulations that we have run. And basically for a given state, the value network tells you, what to expect in the future while being in that state. And of course, like I don't mention explicitly, but this value network is now a neural network that has parameters, and we will optimize the network's parameters based on this loss function. Okay. Now, the second important piece of PPO is the advantage estimate. So if you are in a certain state and then you take an action and you transition to the next state, what the advantage tells you, if that action was actually favorable in the sense that it brought you into a state where you have like even better expectations, right? So this is what this advantage estimate delta here expresses. And of course, we are not interested in, just maximizing a local advantage estimate in a single step, but we want to maximize the advantage over the entire trajectory for the entire length of the simulation. And this is basically what the generalized advantage estimate is. So you see, again, we have the sum over the entire trajectory of our advantage estimates, and then they are again weighted by some kind of parameter that is slightly smaller than 1. Now the final piece, and that's the actual loss function that is basically optimized to create your control law. So it's the most important part. It's actually not called a loss function, but an objective function in the classical reinforcement learning context. So basically, you want to maximize this function, right? And so basically, what the policy objective entails is, first of all, the advantage estimate that we just saw. So the definition, we just saw the definition, and this advantage estimate is going to be positive if the actions we took were actually, favorable, and it's going to be negative if, the actions were worse than the current policy, basically. And so this varies between like positive and negative, right? And what we have here on the left side is basically the ratio of the current policy and the old policy, right? And this policy is again the part that is basically the neural network with parameters. So this part here is going to be changed in the optimization loop. Okay, and what we want to do is basically we want to make actions that are associated with a positive advantage, we want to make them more likely. So you want to make this fraction larger, right? And actions with a negative advantage, we want to make less likely. So you want to reduce the ratio of current policy and old policy. Now the true objective function is actually slightly more complicated. There's a bit of clipping, which is really important to make the learning more robust. And there's also something called entropy, which is simply a term, that such that the objective or the loss actually never goes really to zero. So such that the agent doesn't go into a local minimum too early, but that it keeps exploring. All right, so this was the most essential piece of theory that you need to understand what I'm going to show you next. And so the results I'm going to present are basically created by two students. You can find the material, like how exactly it was implemented and the improvements in the two GitHub repositories linked here on the slide. I'm also going to show you in a bit a more recent resource that you can use if you want to explore a bit more in detail how it works. And the actual application here that I will show you is a rather simple one, because this entire field is still very new, right? And we still have to learn a lot. So this simple benchmark case is basically the laminar flow past the cylinder, and at the given Reynolds number, in the laminar regime, we have some periodic vortex shedding. So we have the formation of the von Karman vortex street. And what we might be interested in is that, for example, we reduce the drag and lift forces that are acting on the cylinder, or that we mitigate, in general, more in general, like mitigate extreme events, right? If you have a gust acting on your airfoil's surface or something like that. But you could also reverse the objective and say, okay, I actually, in some sense, I want to maximize the steering in the wake of my cylinder, such that my mixing becomes better, my heat transfer becomes better, my mass transfer becomes better, in that kind of sense. So you can solve a variety of different flow problems. What we actually want to do here is we take the cylinder, we measure the pressure on the surface of the cylinder. This is going to be our state or our sensors, if you want. And then we are going to rotate the cylinder. So the rotation is our actuation, and the actual action that is predicted by the policy network is the angular velocity omega. And here is how we redefine the reward. So a goal that we want to achieve here is to minimize drag and lift forces acting on the cylinder. So here is basically how the optimization goal is formulated. We have a constant that from which we subtract basically the drag and the absolute value of the lift. So basically the reward becomes large if our drag goes down or if our lift goes down. And for the lift, we take the absolute value because, it's like fluctuating about positive and negative values. And, we want to minimize like the entire lift forces acting on the cylinder. All right. The implementation consists of basically two pieces. The first one is like a bunch of Python modules where the actual reinforcement learning is done, where we create the networks and where we train the networks, and also where we perform the infrastructure things like setting up new simulations, changing the parameters of the simulations, running the simulations, fetching the data from the simulations. And our implementation here follows like a really nice book, Grokking Deep Reinforcement Learning, which I can really recommend if you want to get started in the field in general. It's really nicely written. Now, the second piece of the implementation consists of an OpenFOAM boundary condition. And what the boundary condition does is it at the beginning of the simulation, it reads the policy network. And then during the simulation, it will evaluate the policy network and apply those actuations, so apply those rotations. And at the end of the simulation, it's going to write down its experience. So the trajectory of, like this was the pressure values on the surface. This is the actuation that I took. And this is how my drag and lift values changed. And this for basically the entire runtime of the simulation. Just to give you an idea how the boundary condition would be used in the velocity file for your initial conditions. So this is the name of the boundary condition. Here are like some things to specify, where the cylinder is located. Here you provide the name of your policy network. The policy network is saved in a torch script format, which is in general a really nice format to exchange, networks between your Python code and your C++ code in general. It's not specific to reinforcement learning. You can also use it for, supervised learning. So, for example, when you do the mapping of boundary conditions from one simulation to another simulation. We can also decide the start time, how often we want to, control, because maybe we don't want to control every numerical time step, because that wouldn't be really sensible. And in the training mode, basically the actions will be sampled from the distribution. If you switch off the training mode, so if you actually want to use your control law, then you will always take the expected value of your distribution. And the last entry basically defines the min and max of the angular velocity. Now, if your training was successful, you will see something like these curves here. So what you see here are the cumulative rewards after each optimization loop. So every episode entails running a bunch of simulation. And what you see here is basically the cumulative rewards for a bunch of different probability distributions. And what I want to point out here is that comparing the beta, which is green, and the Gaussian, which is blue, that with the beta distribution, you first of all reach higher cumulative rewards, and you also reach them much more quickly. So you need to spend less computational effort. And now I want to show you something really interesting. So the problem might seem very trivial to you that we are solving here, right? But I will show you that even for this trivial problem, this deep reinforcement learning optimization can come up with something that is really interesting. So what we compared here is basically the uncontrolled flow, so the drag coefficient in the uncontrolled flow, an open loop controller, and the deep reinforcement learning trained closed loop controller. So you basically see the open loop controller is basically like just a rotation with a prescribed frequency and amplitude. And these two parameters, frequency and amplitude, have been optimized. So this is basically the best open loop controller that you can get. So the orange line. And you see in the mean drag value is similar to the closed loop control, but the fluctuations are still much larger. And instead, basically the closed loop control, so the policy network, brings down the drag by about 5%, I think. And it also significantly reduces the fluctuations. Now, what is really interesting is if you look at the actual control that is performed by the agent or by the policy. So the dashed blue line here is basically the signal of the open loop controller, so just periodic, turning. And the orange line is what the policy network does. And you can see it looks fairly periodic. The frequency is lower than for the open loop controller. And if you look closely, you find that the mean value of this omega signal here, it's slightly larger than 0. So basically, instead, what this means is that instead of just turning back and forth, right, the policy network keeps turning in one direction and then just like slows down a little bit and then keeps turning in this direction, right? And what this control achieves is basically, if you now think like how much energy you would require to actually actuate your flow, because the amplitude is smaller and the frequency is smaller, so the policy network can achieve a better control with much less energy input, which is for this simple example really surprising. Now I want to show you a slightly more complicated example. So what we did here is that instead of just controlling a fixed Reynolds number, we controlled a bunch of Reynolds numbers. So we trained the agent with a bunch of like steady Reynolds numbers. And then we tried to see how the agent would perform if we have an inlet velocity that is changing over time in a sinusoidal way. And here I want to show you a nice animation. On the top, you see the unactuated flow. On the bottom, you see the actuated flow. And the contour is basically colored by means of the velocity's speed, right? You see, because the colors become more and more red, the velocity, inlet velocity is increasing. And then you see at some point here in the lower picture, the controller kicks in and starts, rotating. And then as the inlet velocity goes down again, the controller stops acting. And it really achieves to like really stabilize the vortex shedding. All right, and here's just like the two curves of the drag coefficient. You see, it's not perfect. It could act a little bit more quicker, but it was by no means optimized. Like it was just like a simple trial, basically. All right, final piece of my presentation. I'm also a member of the data-driven modeling special interest group in the OpenFOAM context. So if you want to get in touch, you can go to the OpenFOAM wiki, to our wiki page there. We also have a GitHub repository where we aggregate, a bunch of links to research projects and publications and code libraries and so on. And we have every 2 months or so, we have meetings, and the next one is going to be on the 9th of June. So if you want to participate, just get in touch. You're always welcome. And second of all, at TU Braunschweig, in the winter term, usually I give a lecture, which covers all the topics of machine learning and how they are applied to computational fluid dynamics. So it's basically OpenFOAM on the CFD side and PyTorch on the machine learning side. And the entire resources are also freely available on GitHub. So you find there notebooks, Jupyter notebooks that give you some theory and simple Python toy examples, the slides, and also, for all the stuff that I've shown you, you find the full implementation there, how to implement it in OpenFOAM and PyTorch, for example. But I have to mention, it's not yet complete. I just started it last winter term, and there's still a lot of work to do, basically. All right, then I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer some of your questions if there are any. Thank you.
Dr. Weiner, thank you for a very interesting talk, and from the most basic concept to the specific applications about machine learning and CFD. And I also very appreciated that you have shared most of your code and data through the internet. I think many researchers like us will benefit from this. Thank you. And for the audience, if you have any questions about this talk, please submit them in the chat function in the Zoom. So now I will go through all the questions asked by the audience and ask Dr. Weiner one by one, right? By themselves. The first question is from Hao Xu. Hi, Dr. Weiner. May I know which type of neural network you selected in the node? Dr. Weiner?
Is it related? So mostly I use very simple, fully connected neural networks, like the simplest form of neural networks that you can use. And you know, how deep the network should be, or like how many neurons it should have, you find by a very quick, you know, hyperparameter study. And usually for everything that I've shown you, like including the supervised learning example and the reinforcement learning, we are talking about like really small networks, like maybe 4 layers in depth, 4 hidden layers, and maybe 50 neurons per layer. Nothing crazy.
Okay, and the next question is from DA Xu. Hi, Dr. Weiner. May I ask why you choose to place sensors on the surface of cylinder instead of in the wake region, and how you determine the layout of sensor placement, since it affects the control performance a lot?
Yeah. So like placing the sensors on the surface was just, you know, to try something new, basically. It doesn't make a big difference whether you place them on the surface or whether you place them in the wake. So I think the initial reason why we place them on the surface is because you know, my institute is more working in the field of aerodynamics for aircrafts and for cars, vehicles in general. And you know, it's more realistic that you get actually information from the surface, rather than if you think about, you know, you have like your airfoil and the flow is coming from the left now to the right, and what you get probably is like the signal of a pressure probe that you have maybe somewhere, you know, or maybe a little bit maybe upstream, right? And then you have to maybe control your flaps based on the pressure from the sensors. So it's unlikely that you have, you know, like somewhere in the wake that you can get information about the pressure. But in general, you know, it doesn't really change much. So typically, if you use the sensors on the surface, the control problem is slightly harder to solve than when you use them in the wake, where you have precise information about the vortex shedding, let's say. But like both reaches very similar performances. And also, yeah, sensor placement is a very important topic for reinforcement learning. And from my point of view, so employing reinforcement learning together with computational fluid dynamics simulations has the big advantage that you can solve those sensor placement problems by including them into the optimization problem. So probably you know that there are like a bunch of different optimal sensor placement techniques, which basically will take the unactuated flow and then make some suggestions where you should place the sensors. And the problem then is, once you start actuating your flow, it changes the entire dynamics potentially of your flow, right? So you don't know if your sensor placement is still optimal. And you can actually include the sensor placement into the reinforcement learning algorithm. And they're already, like, if you like on one of the links, you find already a link to an article where this was done. And it's still fairly new. There's no, you know, like perfectly proven method how to do it. It's a very active field of research. But yeah, the main advantage is that the sensor positions that you get from these optimizations, they include also the influence, the feedback of the actuation onto what the sensors output, so onto the dynamics of your flow.
Okay, thank you. And next question is from Boson Wang. And hi, Andrew, thank you for your talk. Compared with other active control algorithms, how do you balance the stability and the controlling delay in your RL method? Does it have advantage from this point?
I'm not sure if I understand the question 100%. So
maybe ML method, I think.
You mean like maybe like machine learning control, in the sense that like what Bernd Noack, for example, is doing, like that you have like a a genetic algorithm that creates your control law.
Okay, maybe person one can ask.
So
yeah.
nonetheless, I can explain you some of the advantages of deep reinforcement learning. So first of all, what is really cool, and I just realized this after having already started for a while in the field. So basically, the optimization, so the control law, it is basically like created from nothing, right? You have just like a network with randomly initialized parameters, and the actual control law is created from this optimization process. So it's not that you provide some initial kind of shape function that has already a certain like you prescribe maybe a library of different shape functions telling you how the control law could potentially look like, and then you assemble them by means of optimization. But the control law in the reinforcement learning is really created basically from just a neural network. This is one really cool aspect that I haven't understood for a really long time. And it's also the main point to distinguish reinforcement learning from many other optimization algorithms for solving flow control problems.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The next question. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and maybe one more point that is really important. Reinforcement learning is basically it does the optimization based on gradient descent, right? So it's quite effective in a sense because it's using the gradient information, but it also has some built-in features to overcome the typical negative aspects of gradient-based optimization, namely that they get stuck in local optima. And that is basically they have this mix of functional approximation, but also like random exploration based on the probability functions. So this is why I haven't seen like a rigorous benchmark yet, but my expectation is that in terms of like sample efficiency and the final control performance, it will be hard to basically top what reinforcement learning can give you once it's really at the state that as like all the other control algorithms.
Okay, and next question is from Professor Huangwei Zhang. Hi, Andrew. Thank you very much for the very nice talk. Have you trial methods for turbulent flows? Any comment for this direction?
Yes, so I haven't tried it on turbulent flows yet. I think nobody has, because one obvious limitation is that it becomes very expensive if your simulation becomes very expensive. And if you think of turbulence flows in the sense that you have like an LES simulation, then yeah, it's you would require either a very large amount of computational power, or you have to supplement the standard reinforcement learning with some kind of model-based training. So this is also a very active field of research to make the reinforcement learning with this very expensive environment more effective. So make more effective use of the data. You basically take the entire simulations that you have already performed, you create a reduced order model, and then for a bunch of episodes, you learn from the reduced order model instead of performing simulations. But this is not yet working, no, at least not very well. And once this is working, then I think any kind of flow is in reach if you have a good amount of computational power on top of that, yes. But to come back to the basic question, I think as far as my knowledge goes, nobody has yet applied this to a more challenging flow involving turbulence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the next question is from Professor Wiley Chan. Thank Andrea for a very insightful and clear presentation. I may be mistaken here, but doesn't seem like the CFD simulations were of very high resolution. Yeah, this is his question.
If they are of very low or very high resolution?
Very high resolution.
Sorry, yes. maybe I can just chime in here because my questions got cut off. Thank you, Andre, again for the questions. Actually, I was trying to ask, like, it seems like some of your results are not of that high resolution. So I wanted to know, like, is that by design because of the more canonical way that you are performing some of these cases, or are you just like running cost cases on purpose for the practicality? So I wanted to know, like, is it important for us to have the necessary resolutions for the problem?
Yes, a very, very good question, very important one. So basically, what we have found is, of course, if you have like a coarse mesh, right, then everything becomes easier, everything becomes more practical, because you can simply run the simulation much quicker. Everything is less painful, right? And we have also found that you can, under some conditions, use that controller that was created on the coarse mesh simulation, and it will give you similarly good performance on a fine mesh. And what you can also do, what is interesting, is that you can, pre-train on a coarse mesh, and you can actually use your finer mesh to improve the policy even further in order to save some computational cost. So the main criterion, let's say, is that the coarse mesh simulation must entail basically the main dynamics of your flow. That's basically it. If your mesh is fine enough in that sense, you can already use it to train your policy network. And yeah, so it's mostly practicality that in the animation that I showed you, the mesh was rather coarse, especially in the wake, because we are not, there are no sensors in our simulation. So we don't really care so much what happens in the wake. If you had sensors located in the wake, then probably you would also need a somewhat higher resolution in the wake.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you. And next question is from Yi Gao. Hi, what's your opinion of physical informed neural network to predict complex flow field?
Okay, that's I expected this question already earlier, because it's like currently a very, a big buzzword, physics informed neural networks. So basically, when I worked still on my PhD topic, I had to approximate like reactive boundary layers of chemical species in two-phase flows using some machine learning technique. And basically, the first thing I tried was to directly solve the partial differential equations for the chemical species by means of what is now called physics-informed neural networks. And I was really excited about that. And I have to say the boundary layers are actually rather simple. So the shapes of the boundary layers are rather simple. And yet it was like very painful to create good approximations. And like I couldn't find a single case where, this workflow of creating data and then training the model would outperform the physics-informed approach. So the data-driven models were always better in terms of accuracy, and they were like on orders of magnitude faster than training the physics-informed stuff. A lot of progress has happened, I have to say, since then. This was like back in 2017 or so 5 years ago. So a lot has happened, and the optimization has become better. But those boundary layer profiles, they were really simple, and I would be really suspicious if you told me I can, approximate like a very nice turbulent flow with some spatially resolved scales using physics-informed neural networks. So maybe they have, some niche applications in cases where you have, very little data, and you want to basically train a model based on this very limited amount of data, and you need some additional regularization. Then maybe you will include some derivative terms, or in the more general sense, like divergence terms, Laplacian terms, into your loss function, to regularize your optimization problem. I can see that kind of application, but what I cannot see is that, you know, the physics-informed neural network is going to replace a simulation. I don't see that coming.
Okay, thank you. And next question is from Fabian Brunstone. Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. Do you have any experience for reinforcement learning outside from flow control? For example, for optimizing boundary conditions or model coefficient to fit the simulation to existing data? Could this be better compared to other optimization approaches?
Yeah, so basically, there's a lot of a bunch of topics that I haven't talked about today, which go in this direction of you know, solving, like there are so many approaches for solving solving optimization problems using machine learning, or solving them in a quicker manner. And yeah, so these inverse problems, of course, is a big field. You can also use reinforcement learning there. You can use reinforcement learning to solve shape optimization. You can also use, you know, other approaches like the branch of like Bayesian, but the family of Bayesian algorithms, where you basically, you know, do exactly that. You have like a model that tells you where you should investigate your flow next, or like in which kind of parameter configuration you should investigate your flow next, because there's some uncertainty, or you expect, you know, the best agreement with something. And yeah, so there's a huge field basically, and it's not just like deep neural networks or reinforcement learning, but you know, you can use all sort of machine learning techniques to simplify optimization problems.
Okay, thank you. I think because of time limitation, I think we will have 2 more questions. And the next question is from Ali Sharifan. And dear Dr. Weiner, since this method you used was for laminar flows, what do you recommend for turbulent flows?
So what I recommend, okay, like outside of deep reinforcement learning, I don't really know what to recommend, because I mean, there is nothing. If you look at, you know, modern aircraft or cars, I haven't seen yet one where there is like really active flow control, closed loop active flow control implemented to reduce, for example, the drag of the drag acting on your aircraft. So I think this is an open problem. And in the terms of deep reinforcement learning, if you want to make it work for more complex cases, essentially what you need is more computational power. And what we also need on the algorithmic side is to make the training algorithm, so for example, PPO, more tailored towards CFD, more tailored towards having very expensive environments to evaluate. So because these algorithms, right, they come from the field of, you know, gameplay, where you have very different input features to create your control. So they are not by no means optimized to, you know, the nice smooth like fields that we have in fluid dynamics. So I think there's a lot of potential. And yeah, so those are the 2 aspects: computational power and algorithmic improvements, in the sense what I have mentioned already earlier, model-based reinforcement learning, for example.
Okay, thank you. Now we come to the last question. Is from Shijie Xu. Thank you, Dr. Weiner. Could you comment on the efficiency of the institute coupling of OpenFOAM with PyTorch? For example, if you use CPU for OpenFOAM while GPU for PyTorch, will it result in a low efficiency due to data transfer?
Very good question. So far, I have to say, as I mentioned earlier, the neural networks that I have employed in all the different fields, supervised and reinforcement learning, those networks are rather small, right? And the first part of the question I would answer as follows. So in general, evaluating the networks in OpenFOAM using the torch script format, so this particular intermediate format of the PyTorch framework, right? This is extremely efficient. So this runs like the evaluation of your network runs as efficient as executing native C++ code. And because the networks are so small, it's absolutely not worth it to transfer the data to the GPU and to make the calculation on the GPU and then to transfer the prediction back to the CPU. I haven't tried it. It works. It's possible. Also with torch script, but have never had a situation that would require execution on the GPU. So in general, I would say like stick to the CPU unless there is, you have like really large networks having like maybe above 10 million parameters.
Okay, thank you. This will be our last question. And I would like to thank Dr. Weiner again for this very interesting talk. And I would also like to thank you all for attending this with OpenFOAM and Combustion simulation webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weiner. Thank you.